Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my June wrap-ups. I'm still a month behind on my wrap-ups, but I'm doing okay. I read 7 things in the month of June. Many of them were in preparation for Hugo voting, some of them were not, but none of these are things that I've done full reviews of or I'm planning on doing full reviews of, so I don't get to like skip over any of them and say go watch my review. So this is going to be a longer wrap-up. I may have to film it in 2 parts, but it's definitely going to be edited into one in the long run. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Windwitch by Susan Dennard. This is the second book in the Witchland series, and this is my last straggling thing that I read for the BookTube SFF Awards. This was nominated in the Young Adult category. It did not win either the judges' vote or the popular vote, I don't think. But I read Truth Witch in preparation for reading this. Both the first and second books in this series got a 3-star rating for me. I've enjoyed them, but I've had problems with them. So basically, this book has 3 separate plot lines that never interact. Sophia, Isolde, and Merrick from the first book are all separated from each other and having their own parallel magical peril adventures. Sophie and the Empress Vanessa run afoul of some hellbards, which were introduced in the first book, but what the hellbards are and, you know, why they are what they are have not been defined at all, and it turns out that Sophie really doesn't know what's up with the hellbards, and it's some weird magic stuff. Isolde is trying to find Sophia. She ends up striking a truce with the Blood Witch Aedouan, who has been sent to find her, and they team up to go looking for Sophie together. Isolde is learning about the weird dark magic of thread witchery and wondering what the heck is up with the puppeteer, who is a thread witch who like talks to her in her dreams. And then Merrick is running around the capital city of his country after being thought to have been killed. He's in disguise because he has all these burn scars from the accident that supposedly killed him and no one recognizes him. He is the Windwitch of the title, and his plotline revolves around the relationship between himself and his sister Vivia, who is the crown princess. She was painted as the villainess of the first book, but obviously in this book it turns out that there's really more just of a misunderstanding between her and Merrick. They've been estranged for a long time, they don't really know each other that well anymore, and he's made a lot of assumptions about where she's coming from with the decisions that she's making, and those assumptions aren't exactly accurate. Merrick's plotline also has weird dark magic, possibly the biggest, weirdest, and most perilous of the 3 sort of weird magical happening subplots that are happening in this book. So that's a little more plot detail than I would usually want to go into for a sequel, but there are a couple big points that I want to make about this. And the first is how frustrating it was for me to have the 3 parallel plot lines that did not end up intersecting at all over the course of this book. It's one of my pet peeves in some YA type fiction, that you'll have, like, for a whole book, 2 main characters who don't meet up, like, until the very end. This was 3 main characters separated who didn't meet up in this book at all. So this felt really like filler, like nothing is really going to happen in this series until these plot lines converge, and this didn't do it. Next, something I actually appreciated about this book that's going to lead, however, into something I didn't like all that much. There is, in each of these plot lines, sort of a running theme that connects them all of discovering that the people who were sort of positioned as the enemies, as the villains, as the antagonists in the first book are all sort of revealed to not really be the big bad. Maybe they can even be allies. I have to admit I wanted more of Vanessa in Sophia's plotline. That plotline seemed to revolve more about their relationship with the hellbards who have taken them captive. And I wasn't such a big fan of that. In Isolde's plotline, we've known from the first book that Aedouan wasn't really a villain because we've had chapters from his point of view from the first book onwards. And then in Merrick's plotline, we obviously have the major through line with Vivia. I like this as a unifying theme for a book in a series like this. What I do not like is that we are 2 books in, and by the end of this book we haven't identified what the actual problem is yet. And 2 books in, is a little far in a series for me for that. We've sort of eliminated all the potential villains from book 1 from consideration. We've introduced 3 plot lines of weird dark magic, but we don't know where the magic is coming from or why or like what the end goal is. Those are all still magical mysteries that have to be solved. And so by the end of this book, we still don't know like what it is that these characters are all going to eventually have to team up to combat. And the problem of a book or series doesn't necessarily have to be a villain in the traditional sense. It can be like just a weird dark magical power. I like that less, but there are things beyond that. There are many more possibilities of what the problem of a series can be. But by 2 books in, I kind of want to have a clue of what it is. So for both of those reasons, 3 plot lines that don't intersect, and we don't know what the overall problem is, this book felt a little too much like it was just drawing the series out and not actually delivering any of the goods. And because I don't yet know what the problem is, I'm not invested in the characters being able to fix it. So 3 stars for this for me. Whether or not I shall continue with this series, you know, I might not. It's in the hands of the fates. One thing I want to mention about the representation in this book, there is a supporting character in this who is trans, but we don't learn that he is trans until the very end because we see this character entirely from Merrick's point of view, who thinks that he is a cross-dressing girl in disguise as a boy, and so he's misgendering Cam in his mind the entire book. And while that may have been necessary for Merrick's storyline of willfully misunderstanding the people around him, I felt like it would not have hurt anything to give Cam a couple of point-of-view chapters at some point earlier in the book, so that readers could understand Cam and his storyline much earlier on. I don't think it needed to be the sort of reveal at the end that it was presented as. Next, we have Space Opera by Catherynne and Valente, which was one of my most anticipated reads of the year. This is comedic science fiction with plenty of florid, over-the-top language about basically a Eurovision in space competition. In this story, the aliens arrive on Earth and they tell us, you are going to have to compete in the Intergalactic Grand Prix, and you are going to have to place higher than last place amongst the intergalactic civilization and all of their best bands, or else humanity is going to be destroyed, because you are going to be a threat to us if you discover our intergalactic civilization. You obviously have violent tendencies as a species, and so you are only going to be worthy of being introduced into our intergalactic civilization if you can prove that you are sentient and feeling and people enough to put on a good show. The task falls to washed-up has-been musical superstar Decibel Jones, of Decibel Jones and the Absolute Zeros. And the chapters in this book sort of alternate between sort of big picture narrating the story of the Intergalactic Grand Prix and the sentience wars of years past, to which the Intergalactic Grand Prix is a response, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the story of Decibel Jones. Only 2 of the 3 band members of Decibel Jones and the Absolute Zeros remain. The band broke up after the death of one of their members, Mira Wonderful Star, and that loss is sort of the central heartbreak that tore the 2 remaining members apart and left Decibel sort of broken. There's a lot that I like about this. This is one of a couple books that I sort of latched onto recently because I have been craving hopeful science fiction that maybe goes very dark or comes from a dark place, but ultimately provides a vision of the future that is like worth living for or striving towards. And a multicultural alien civilization that decided at some point along the way that instead of having a ton more wars, they were going to fight it all out in a singing competition is definitely that. The tagline on the back of the book, which keeps getting repeated throughout the story, is "Life is beautiful and life is stupid," and that's basically the central belief of this story, that sentient life is simultaneously capable of the greatest art and the worst atrocities, but this is ultimately a book where what's beautiful and stupid does win out over what's evil and stupid, and there is a lot that is evil and stupid. Not only is Valente's portrayal of the sentience wars in the alien civilization commentary on human history of atrocity and violence and warfare, but also the near future setting of Earth in this story, while only hinted at and never actually described in any detail, is pretty clearly not a great argument for what humanity will manage to achieve on the intergalactic stage. This seems to me to be an Earth that has seen a second rise of fascism of some sort and really suffered for it, even though we only really get to see it through the personal sufferings of Decibel Jones and his band. As for the writing style of the book, it is still very flowery Catherynne Valente writing, but it's a comedic voice that I don't think she's used before, and it was really interesting for me to see her pull that off. Some of the humor really hit home for me, some of it didn't quite land. I think that's always true for me for comedic books. Some of the jokes work better than others. The humor in this is rather eclectic, you know, throw spaghetti at a wall, some of it'll stick, and it'll probably be different jokes for different people that really, really work. You do have to really commit to the very dense language that it's delivered in, but I think that's true of all of Valente's writing. I would be interested to see if she's ever going to write more comedic books, because I would be really interested to see where that comedic voice would develop from here. I cannot give this a full 5 stars, not only because some of the bits hit me harder than others, and yeah, some of the serious bits also hit me harder than others of the serious bits. It did feel a little uneven throughout. There were passages that were obviously genius, and then some that just felt like filler. But also because I wanted more actual intergalactic Grand Prix than I got. Like, the whole thing is about this massive reality show singing competition, which is just like so much drama, but the actual singing competition reality show drama is really just the very, very end of the book, and I wanted more of it. I felt like I had been teased this great show for the whole book, and then we just sort of skimmed over a lot of the intergalactic Grand Prix itself. But I still gave this 4 stars because I am just so touched and moved by anything that gives me like a world where humanity can save itself through art and not through war. I'm running out of time for filming this afternoon, so I'm going to jump ahead to the last of the library books I have to return today before the library closes, and then I'll go back to the book before this next. This is Ninefox Gambit by Yoon Lee. I read this because the second book, Raven Stratagem, which I read in July, was nominated both for the Hugo and the BookTube SFF Awards. I was too late for the BookTube SFF Awards. I was not too late for Hugo voting. This series is military SF, and a lot of people have talked about this series on YouTube very eloquently, and I think I benefited greatly from having heard lots of people describe this book before I read it, so I knew what to expect, and I wasn't nearly as flummoxed and floundering as I might have been. So I'm also going to try to give a pretty clear explanation of what this is and what it's doing, so that if you pick it up, I can have passed on the favor. This is about a space empire called the Hexarchate, and the Hexarchate is made up of 6 governing factions that sort of serve as a cross between, like, Hogwarts houses and branches of government. So if you choose to enter government service, you will enter training with one of the factions that is hopefully well suited to your personality. The other main thing that's going on here is the calendar and calendrical warfare. This is a world where it has been discovered that subscribing to a calendar, a system of beliefs that's more than just, you know, the actual dates and numbers of a calendar, although that's part of it. It is really a system of beliefs that adheres to that calendar. If everyone in a certain region adheres to that calendar, then certain exotic effects are possible, that being technology based on advanced mathematics that only works with a certain calendar. And those exotic effects take the form in the military of like really horrific, seemingly magical weapons, and also like shields against that sort of weapon. So to me, it was fairly clear once I got a grasp on some of that world building that obviously this entire system is inherently tyrannical. That's sort of hammered home by a couple of things. First, like, the high calendar of the Hexarchate involves things like ritual torture in order to function. And second, we know that a heretical rebellion that happened in the past arose from the 7th faction of what was formerly the Heptarchate, and it does not bode well that that heresy that rose up and was quashed long ago came from the faction that had been focused on ethics and philosophy. So from pretty early on, if you're paying attention, you've gotten some pretty broad hints that possibly the Hexarchate are the bad guys, and given that the whole book is told sort of from a Hexarchate perspective, you know, we are the bad guys. And I think the effectiveness of this first book in the series is sort of banking on its ability to distract you from that for a large portion of the book. And then being able to sort of spring it back at you at the end like, oh, you did know this all along, didn't you? And so because that didn't quite work for me, because I wasn't really distracted by the show, and I'll get into what that is in just a sec, the book as a whole wasn't as effective for me as it could have been. Now, what's actually happening in here is that we're following a character named Cheris, and she is of the Kel, which is basically the backbone of the Hexarchate's military. They are the faction that is obsessed with chain of command and loyalty. They've even gone so far as to develop something called formation instinct, where all of the Kel are actually like injected with something that makes them like physically compelled to obey their superiors. But Cheris is a Kel captain who has an extraordinary ability with math that would make her potentially better suited for one of the other factions, but she has personal reasons where she felt like she really wanted to be in the Kel. We open on a battle scene, and I really don't like books that open on battle scenes. It just makes it so much harder for me to get into them because battle scenes are sort of the hardest scenes for me to get sort of emotionally involved in. But we open on a battle scene where Cheris uses her mathematical ability on the battlefield to alter formations so that her Kel soldiers can deal with heretical technology. But of course that's very dangerous because to do that means to sort of engage in heretical mathematics herself, and so she comes to be a person of interest higher in the ranks of the Hexarchate. She gets sort of manipulated into seemingly choosing a course of action for the task of retaking a major fortress that has been overtaken by heretics. And to do this, she's bonded with a weapon in the Kel arsenal that is actually sort of the ghost of a dead general who was actually from one of the other factions, the Shuos. Now, Shuos Jadao is a historical figure of legendary proportion, having had the most genius career until he inexplicably committed a massacre, turning on his own army. He is supposed to have gone mad, although why or how have never been solved. But the resurrected consciousness of Jadao with his brilliant tactical mind is the weapon that Cheris is saddled with to take into the siege of this fortress to retake it for the Hexarchate. So we've got a couple things going on that are occupying our attention for most of the book. The more compelling to me was the relationship between Cheris and Jadao. Jadao's faction, the Shuos, are sort of military intelligence and espionage in the Hexarchate, and that combined with his history lead to this constant struggle of how much can Cheris trust him. He's anchored in her mind in a way where she can interact with him, but he can't interact with anyone else. So he has to act through her, and she has to be the judge of when he's telling her the truth, when she can trust him, when she should follow his orders. In the meantime, he's sort of undertaking to instruct her as a pupil in a whole lot of the areas like tactics and stuff where he's really genuinely brilliant. That was the more compelling part of this story for me. What we spend most of our time on, really, though, is the siege of the Fortress of Scattered Needles. And I'm just not that interested in all of the pure adventure battle tactics and all of the twists and turns of that plot line, as sort of really cleverly plotted out as they are. I've heard several reviewers talking about this book saying that all of the, really complicated world building is sort of the thing you have to get over to get into what's really a pure, simple, exciting, Take the Fortress story. My problem is that I'm not interested in the Take the Fortress story. I'm interested in all the other stuff. Because if you have been paying attention to all of the ideas and concepts of this story, and it's made pretty clear pretty early on why the series is called The Machineries of Empire, you can tell that Take the Fortress story is a bit of a distraction. And I was sort of eager to be done with it and be on to the big picture. I'm also gonna say that the sort of ending twist of this book is something that I've seen done as the ending of the first books in so many YA fantasy series that I almost laughed a little. So I gave Ninefox Gambit 3 stars. I will tell you I gave the second book, Raven Stratagem, a higher rating at 4 stars, but you're going to have to wait until my July wrap-up to hear me talk about Raven Stratagem. Okay, I'm back. Before I move on to the next book I'm going to talk about, I remember there was one more thing I wanted to say about space opera that I didn't get in there. Each of the chapter titles in this book is the title of a Eurovision song, some of them in translation, so you might have to do some Googling. I did the thing where as I read this, I watched all of the performances that were referenced in those chapter titles, and it was fun, but it slowed me down. I think I would have gotten through this book much faster if I hadn't been doing that, and honestly, some of those performances are way more fun to watch than others. Okay, the next book is one I had to return to the library as soon as I finished it, and that is A Feast of Sorrows by Angela Slatter, which is a collection of her short stories. A bunch of these had been published previously elsewhere, a couple of them had not. I will link as many of them as I can find online down in the description below. Basically, she has published 2 previous short story collections that all take place in this universe, those being Sourdough and Other Stories and the Bitterwood Bible and Other Recountings, and I think those are both out of print and hard to find, but this collection has some stories from each of those plus some newer ones. So the table of contents here is Sourdough, Dresses 3, Bluebeard's Daughter, The Jacaranda Wife, Light as Mist and Heavy as Hope, The Coffin Maker's Daughter, By the Weeping Gate, St. Dymphna's School for Poison Girls, By My Voice I Shall Be Known, Sister Sister, The Badger Bride, The Tallow Wife, What Shines Brightest Burns Most Fiercely, and Bearskin. And because I don't have the book with me, I can't check back and refresh my memory on any of these stories as I wrap them up here. But all of these take place in her same sort of fantasy fairy tale world that she has built, except for The Jacaranda Wife, which takes place in historical Australia. I would say that overall this is a dark fairy tale book about morally questionable girls and women. A lot of Slater's characters do bad things, and sometimes it gets them to, something like a happy ending, and sometimes it doesn't, and you can tell that she loves her characters either way, regardless of whether they make good choices or bad choices, and how those choices end up for them. I would also put a content warning for abuse of various sorts on this collection. It's not in every story, but it seems to be a bit of a running theme. Sourdough is one of those stories where the protagonist achieves a happy ending by really dark means. Dresses 3 is a bit of a donkey skin retelling about a seamstress. Bluebeard's Daughter is a wild fairy tale pastiche about a character who is in fact Bluebeard's daughter and is sent off on a task by her latest stepmother, who is sort of trying to get rid of her. The Jacaranda Wife is a story that has sort of the structure of a Selkie type story, except it's about a tree woman instead of a seal woman. Light as Mist, Heavy as Hope is not one that I'm remembering exactly which story that is based on the title itself. I think by process of elimination, that's the one that was a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. And it was a kind of creepy retelling, but not a particularly, like, wild out-of-the-box one. The Coffin Maker's Daughter is sort of like the origin story for a character named Hepzibah Valentine, who shows up in later stories in the collection, both in person and by reference. And she is another dark, creepy character with a kind of dark, creepy origin story. By the Weeping Gate is a story about, like, a family of prostitutes and what happens when the mother of all of these girls tries to marry one of them off into high society. And it goes very poorly. St. Dymphna's School for Poison Girls is the only one of these I've read before. It's about a girl who infiltrates this school for girls who are being trained to be assassins and, like, marry into their enemies' families and murder their husbands. But this girl is actually there to try to copy out a book that these headmistresses have been concealing and bring it back to the scholars that she's trained under. By My Voice I Shall Be Known is sort of a riff on Rusalka and mermaid fairy tale themes, about a girl who's out for vengeance against a guy who has basically exploited her and then left her for another woman. Sister Sister is about a queen who has fallen from grace and her sister who orchestrated her downfall and, like, took her place. It turns out to be something of a changeling story. The Badger Bride is another one about a sort of scholarly girl, so I liked it. It's also got some animal transformation elements. The Tallow Wife is the longest story in this collection. It's actually a full novella. I think the only other really long story in here is St. Dymphna's School for Poison Girls, and it's not quite as long as The Tallow Wife. The Tallow Wife is apparently meant to be the sort of cornerstone story for a whole nother forthcoming collection of tales in this world, sort of a new generation of stories. You see that some of these characters across, like, the generations of her stories, become folk tales or legends from the past, and these new characters take their place. And then the last two stories, What Shines Brightest Burns Most Fiercely and Bearskin, are both directly connected to The Tallow Wife. I would go so far as to call them both sequel stories that follow different characters from that first story. The Tallow Wife is another story about a well-off married society lady who suffers a fall from grace. And while she doesn't herself appear in the next two stories, the idea of her revenge does. Interestingly, those other two, What Shines Brightest Burns Most Fiercely and Bearskin, center more strongly around male characters than any of the other stories in this book. Bearskin is about one of Cordelia, I think is her name, one of Cordelia's sons, and What Shines Brightest Burns Most Fiercely also centers around a couple of male characters. So yeah, the overall feeling that I get from this collection is that you leave most of these stories without a really strong sense about how you're supposed to feel about these characters and what they've done and the endings that they've gotten. I think some of this collection veered further towards horror than I really like, but I loved the exploration of a lot of these darker fairy tale themes, and I would definitely recommend it if that's something that you're interested in. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I read was Summer in Orcus by T. Kingfisher, who's a pen name for Ursula Vernon. This is one of the nominees in the new Not a Hugo Award category. And I read a copy of this that was in the Hugo voter packet. This is a type of book that I am predisposed to like, a sort of introspective pastiche on the portal fantasy genre. This is about a girl named Summer with an incredibly, horrifically overprotective mother who doesn't let her do anything even remotely dangerous. It's pretty clear that Summer's mother has a lot of issues, and Summer has learned how to be the emotional support for her mother instead of vice versa at a really painfully young age. And so one day, Summer is visited by Baba Yaga in her chicken-legged house, and Baba Yaga says that she will grant Summer her heart's desire. She doesn't say what her heart's desire is. Summer ends up on this portal fantasy adventure in a land called Orcus. She knows that Baba Yaga sent her and that she's supposed to find her heart's desire, whatever that may be, and she sets off to see what's gonna happen. And what do you know? This adventure falls into her lap. She acquires a few traveling companions, like you do in a portal fantasy. She's got a friend who's a talking weasel, and then they meet a hoopoe and a wolf who is a warehouse who turns into a house at night. Summer ends up being pursued by some evil forces, and eventually she has to go seek out the Queen in Chains, who seems to be the source of all of these problems, but whom no one has ever seen, and no one really knows who or what the Queen in Chains is. So as I said, this is a type of story that I really like. It's not quite as good as, say, the Fairyland series. I think that's sort of the gold standard for me for, modern takes on classic portal fantasy, but this is still definitely a book that ends up having interesting things to say about why certain children might be well suited to certain fantasy adventures. The resolution of this story was one that I found really moving, perhaps because it felt sort of unusual, and there are plenty of clever little bits and pieces along the way. So I gave this 4 stars. If that sort of story is your thing, this might be one you want to check out. Next, I read a novella that is nominated for the Hugos this year, and that is The Black Tides of Heaven by J.Y. Yang. It is nominally the first book in the Tensorit series, of which the first 2 were released simultaneously as companion books that you could read in either order. This ended up being my least favorite of the novella nominees this year. Not because it's bad, but just because it was such a strong field overall. And I had slightly more mixed feelings on this than a lot of the sort of gushing reviews that I've seen. This is set in an Asian-inspired silk punk fantasy world, which is ruled over by the Protector. And at the beginning of this novella, the head abbot of the Grand Monastery is trying to claim his end of a bargain that he made with the Protector. She is supposed to give one of her children over to the monastery to be raised there. And instead of sending the child who wants to go, the Protector has given birth to what turns out to be twins, and she tells the abbot that, oh, you may have these twins for your monastery. And basically this is a story that follows these twins, but one of them more than the other, over a long portion of their lives. When they are children, you see that they are just inseparable. One of the things that's important in the world building of this world is that children are not assigned gender at birth. They decide what their gender is when they are ready to decide, and then they are confirmed as their gender, which usually, but not always, involves being medically aligned with the gender that they have chosen to be confirmed as. And these two twins, Mokoyo and Akiha, have some things happen to them that challenges their notion that they are, you know, the same and they will stay the same. That their life paths are joint and that they will always understand each other. Specifically, Mokoyo develops some prophetic abilities that make them sort of a chosen one. And then Akiha has to deal with the consequences of being the unchosen twin. And really, this story is Akiha's story, as he grows up and has a path in life that diverges drastically from Mokoyo's. What I want to say about this, I think, is that there is a ton going on with it, and none of the things that this novella is trying to do are bad. There is just a lot that is only very superficially touched upon, and given that this is supposed to be an I don't know how many book-long series about this world and about the events that happen to these characters and this country, I'm guessing that a lot of that is going to be explored in other books in the series. There is resistance against the sort of tyrannical rule of the Protector, and some of it comes from the Grand Monastery, but some of it comes from this sort of grassroots rebellion movement that is sort of a technology versus magic struggle that's going on here. A lot of what we would sort of think of as the technology in this world is fueled by magic, and so that gives power in society to those who wield magic, and this sort of technological revolution asks, you know, what happens if we give mechanical weapons and technology to people? Can we use that to restore power to the downtrodden? And all of that is just like barely touched on. It's just the backdrop of this story of Akiha going off and growing up and joining this rebellion and eventually returning to make amends with his sister. So you get the sense that this is really supposed to be a character-driven story, and it didn't quite work for me as a character-driven story because we have so many jumps over such long periods of time, so many years that are spanned in all of these jumps between the various sections of the book, where we meet Akiha at different points in his life. And since it is a novella and is so short and tries to cover so much ground here, I felt like we didn't really get a chance to know Akiha at any point in his life before we jump ahead and we have to get to know him all over again. So the reason this only gets 3 stars from me and not higher is because it wasn't as strong a character story as I felt like it wanted to be. I am definitely still interested in reading more of the books in this series, though. The companion to this one, The Red Threads of Fortune, which I think is more about Mokoyo, I've heard takes place over a shorter period of time and focuses on, you know, a certain set of events. And I might personally find that to be more compelling storytelling in this world, so we'll see. And the last book I read in the month of June is another one of those young adult not a Hugo nominees, and this was A Skinful of Shadows by Frances Hardinge, who is the same author as both The Lie Tree and A Face Like Glass, both of which I really liked a lot. This was not bad, it just wasn't quite as good as those other 2 books for me. This is a sort of historical paranormal story about a girl named Makepeace during the English Civil War. It was weird to read this so soon after reading Ninefox Gambit, because this is another book with a main character who gets kind of possessed by ghosts who she can, like, interact with in her head. But obviously this is a very, very different take on that theme. So in this story, Makepeace is told by her mother when she is young that she has to learn how to keep the spirits of the dead out, because she is a person that has, like, a space inside of her that the spirits of the dead will try to possess so that they can cling on to life. A number of things happen. Makepeace's mother dies in an accident that leaves Makepeace full of guilt. She takes into herself the spirit of an abused entertainer's dancing bear who has been beaten to death, and eventually finds this bear to be a kindred spirit to herself, and learns to love bear and guard bear as her secret. And then the bear can also do things for her in return. After her mother's death, Makepeace is sent away with bear inside of her to her father's creepy noble relatives, that her mother has told her nothing about except that she must stay away from their estate at all costs. She becomes a servant in this household and comes to see that they are probably holding on to her for pretty nefarious purposes. Their secret is indeed dark and paranormal and creepy. She also learns that she's got a half-brother here, and she forms a really interesting relationship with him. So that's all basically what's going on in, like, the first half of the book, perhaps. And that all was really, like, ominous and interesting, and I felt like it had this sort of emotional clarity that the later part of the book lost for me. What happens towards the end of the book is that eventually Makepeace escapes and ends up on this, you know, cross-country adventure, espionage, undercover extravaganza. She takes on a couple more ghosts who are frankly just annoying and uninteresting characters, and it just wasn't as interesting for me as the slower setup parts of this book. There are some interesting things that get explored here. Of course, Makepeace gets to see more of both sides of the war and determine really that there's not much that anyone's fighting for that she feels is really worthwhile. But to me, really, the heart of this story is Makepeace and Bear, and how they have both been abused and how good they are for each other. And I felt like that just kind of got lost in the jumble in the whole second half portion of the book that turned into a big adventure romp. So I gave this 3 stars, I think because of all of the, like, kind of creepy paranormal ghost story stuff. This would be a great Octoberish or Halloweenish read if you're looking for one of those. Otherwise, I would probably recommend The Lie Tree over this one as a historical YA fantasy. That just felt sort of slower and broodier throughout to me. Or I would recommend A Face Like Glass for something that's wilder and more adventurous. It was just, you know, much zanier and more creative and unique, in my opinion. So in the interim there, between parts 1 and 2 of filming, I did return the library books that I have, so I don't have the full stack I had in the thumbnail to hold up for you, but these are the ones that I own in print, that I still got here at the end to hold up. There were more books in this wrap-up. That was what I read in June. Hopefully I'll get to July really soon. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you're planning to. Let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.